So before we get into this video, and yes, this is actually, I think, very, very bad. And I think a lot of South Africans doesn't quite understand just how much we're already paying in taxes. And then you add on top of it a secret sort of stealth tax that is being charged on ordinary South Africans by the South African government. And it just makes matters so much worse. And here's the bad part. This particular stealth tax isn't going to get better. In fact, based on what the government is currently doing, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse as time goes on. Like literally year on year, things are going to get worse. But before we get into that, I'm aware that economics is one of those topics where people love talking about the economy. Oh, the economy is so bad. But then when you actually get into like the weeds, it is a difficult topic. And most people just should check out because, like, dude, this doesn't make any sense. As someone that loves economics, I love reading Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Jim Rickards has a number of very, very good books on it. Adam Smith, his books on the father of capitalism, effectively. These are books that I love, and I love the topic. But even when we get to like the actual conversations of the actual economy, you just sort of your eyes sort of glaze over, and you say, I don't understand any of this. Fundamentally, it is important to understand because everything, and I actually think that the economy is made this difficult on purpose by governments around the world because they know ordinary people cannot follow along. They don't understand what's going on. And so by making it this convoluted, everyone just sort of looks at what is immediately identifiable. Is tax going up? No. Then we're good. Is tax going up? Yes. Oh, that's really bad. Is the GDP going up? Good. No. Bad. Right? But there's so much more to it. And the piece I'm going to give you today comes from the Daily Investor, where they actually break down what the hidden taxes in South Africa and how much taxes we can sort of expect to pay in the very, very near future. Now, before we get into this, thanks to changes that YouTube made because they want to fight clickbait or whatever, they made this asinine change where they measure the success of a video based on how many people like the video and how many people comment on the video. Engagement is king. So if by the end of this video you enjoy what I have to say, you think that there's value in what I do, I kindly ask you to smash that like button, leave a comment letting me know exactly what you think of the story today with inflation, with taxation. How are you getting on in South Africa? That's probably one of my best questions. Are you doing okay? Are you struggling? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comment section down below. With that said, let's jump into this. Okay, so from the Daily Investor, government secretly taking money from South Africans. Now, the first thing to understand is a lot of this is tied to government budget deficits. A budget deficit is when the government is spending more money than what they're making. Remember, government cannot just invent money. People like to say the government just prints money. That money isn't invented in a vacuum. That money, all government money, comes effectively from taxes because the government isn't a business. It gets the money from the citizens who work, who make businesses, who pay taxes, and then the government can spend that money. But what do you do when you're a government that spends far more than what you earn? So when we look at this, for example, in 2008, 2009, which was the last time that South Africa ran a surplus on government, the gross loan debt for South Africa was 627 billion rand, which was already quite a bit, but our budget was in surplus, so that was pretty good. Now, at the end of 2024, we are at 5 trillion rand in debt. That is 75% of the total GDP. In fact, it is so bad that just our servicing costs, in other words, we're not paying back the debt, we're just paying the interest on this debt, is 424.9 billion rand in this financial year. That puts us on 1.1 billion rand a day just to pay the debt, not to open schools, hospitals, or any of that, just to pay back the debt that the government is accruing. Now, however, when the debt servicing costs are added, so this is when we get the government has a budget surplus of 0.5%, but that's only looking at the nominal budget. So as soon as you add the debt that we pay, South Africa actually runs a 5% GDP deficit on their budget. In other words, we're spending 5% more money than what we're actually making back. Milton Friedman said this best. What we call a deficit is simply a form of taxation. It is hidden taxation in two main forms, through the printing of money and inflation, or through borrowing. there is one thing you should keep an eye on: how much the government is spending. That is the true tax. Every budget is balanced, and you pay for it through explicit taxes or indirectly in the form of inflation and or borrowing. In South Africa, this is actually made worse, according to the Daily Investor, by the fact that the interest rates the government pay on its debt is higher than the country's nominal economic growth rate. It gets even worse when you actually realize that our government is already paying much higher interest rates than most other countries, because every single time the World Bank and the IMF lowers the credit outlook or the credit score of the country, that means that it gets more expensive for our country to actually lend and borrow money from these institutions. So keep that in mind. Here is a graph of the budget deficit to GDP, and as you will see here, from 2009 onwards, right? So this was 2008, 2009. Then you get 2010, 2011. You'll see that we are constantly running a budget deficit of between 6 and about 4%, constantly, with one outlier year being during the COVID era, right, where we were almost at 10%. This means that all of this stacks, right? So it's a 5% on top of the 5% that you had last year. On top of so it gets worse and worse and worse as time goes on. Now, here's where the hidden tax comes in. When people think of inflation, they think of prices going up, but really that's the wrong way of thinking at it. Thinking about it. It's not prices going up, it's the value of your money going down, and therefore items are still just items, but you need more money in order to do it. The government does this, by the way. The reason the government pushes up inflation is because it also lowers the value of debt. So think about it this way: the government prints and borrows $1 billion or R1 billion worth of debt. But that debt is R1 billion today. If you have inflation at, say, 5%, every year that $1 billion or R1 billion stays there, it gets less in terms of actual real value because the currency is going down. In fact, Dawie Rood explains it as follows. He explained that the rand's value had declined by 99% since 1970. That means if you had 100 rand in 1970, it would be worth the same as 1 rand today. That's the same with debt, right? If you borrowed 100 rand in 1970, you'd basically be paying it as if you were paying 1 rand. And most of us know this, right? Back when I grew up, going to the store, you go with 5 rand, and that was a lot of money. You could get a pie and a Coke and everything that you actually wanted. Today, 5 rand, you give it to the car guard because it's absolutely useless. What are you going to do with this money? Now, here's where the second bit, and this is really the shadowy part. So the government increases prices for every one of us because of inflation, and that is a massive tax on the citizenry because oftentimes what happens is salaries don't keep up at the same rate. While salaries definitely do go up in terms of inflation, that's why we have this 10% increase every single year on salaries and such. It never keeps track, right? So inflation tends to be much higher than what your salary actually goes up. So it actually makes people poorer. But here's where the real problem comes in. You see, after the National Treasury's budget announcement, it was revealed that South Africa will be adding 15.5 billion rand to the government's tax revenue in 2025 and 2026. Well, why exactly? Because the minister, Enoch Godongwani, actually announced that we're not raising taxes. In fact, taxes will stay exactly the same. See, this is where we get to the hidden tax. While taxes will not be increased, the tax brackets will not be adjusted for inflation, meaning that as your salary goes up, because you're trying to keep up with inflation as best you can, but remember, businesses are also suffering and struggling, and there is a cap on what the business can ultimately make, the government will be able to put you in higher and higher tax brackets. These higher and higher tax brackets will ultimately mean that you pay more money to the government because you now fall into a higher tax bracket, all the while your money is worth less than what it was last year, than what it will be next year, right? So fundamentally, we're in this sort of death spiral here in South Africa where our government is playing footsie with one of the worst ideas on this planet, and that is to effectively print itself out of trouble. It keeps needing to borrow money and lend money from all over the world in order to service its own economy because our government is addicted to spending money that it does not have. And then through this debt, it increases inflation. As inflation continues to rise, you know what? People in America will cry over 5% interest rates on houses. Buying a house for 5%, people in America going, what the hell? This is insane. And I'm going, dude, if you could get 5% on a house, on a mortgage, that is insanely good, right? Because here in South Africa, 5%, what are you talking about? No one gets a 5% home loan. And that's where we are, right? Everything. So, for example, I'll just give you guys quickly this. I've never agreed with the argument that how property in South Africa is a great investment. And the reason for it is the standard wisdom is that property is a great investment worldwide, right? In every country in the world, get yourself a property and you're good to go. Because property increases in value by about 10% every single year. But if your interest rate that you get on your house is 12% or 13% per year, your property isn't increasing in value at the same rate as what it's decreasing, or at least what your money is decreasing, right? It's way too expensive for it. And I realize there's a lot more math that goes into it because you'll eventually pay off the loan. Although a lot of people never pay off their home debt because they keep borrowing on it to do stuff around the house, to go on holidays or whatever. People make stupid decisions. I get it. But fundamentally, it's just we're in one of the deepest holes we have ever been in. And the thing that drives me insane is that our government seems to be incapable or disinterested entirely on acting on it. They seem to think, well, we'll just deal with it later. This is a problem that once the chickens come home to roost, there are no easy fixes because these are the kinds of things that ultimately sink a country, especially when places like the World Bank, the IMF, and other countries stop lending money. When they just go, look, you owe way too much. We're just no longer going to give you money. What do you do then when you have an economy that is addicted to debt and you have a people that are so far pushed into debt that it physically can't do anything? Just take a look finally at this chart. This is the money supply for South Africa all the way back till 1994. And you will see it's insane, right? This is in millions. So it's the total money supply in millions of rands. Just look at how it has skyrocketed since. And that line is not coming down, right? We're adding new money every single year. That's where we are right now. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the show. Thank you so much for watching. Massive shout out to all of the patrons. I really appreciate your support. If you want to support this channel, and eventually I want to get some actual investigative journalists that I can pay to send out and find the stories and actually investigate the corruption in this country, that's going to happen over on Patreon. As always, hit the like if you liked it. If you didn't, let me know in the comment section down below what you feel because it helps out the algorithm. And as always, be good to each other, be kind to each other, and I will see all of you in the next one. Peace.